Good evening and welcome to the Indiana University Cinema's virtual screening room. I'm Brittany Friesner, the cinema's Associate Director. Please note that tonight's event will feature live automatic captioning. To turn on captions, move your mouse to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click on Live Transcript, then click Show Subtitle. If you have any issues accessing this feature, please feel free to ask a question using the Q&A box, which is also found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. To begin tonight's program, IU Cinema wishes to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University is built upon the Indigenous homelands and resources of the Mi'kmaq, the Lenape, the Borewadmik, and the Sawanwa peoples. At IU Cinema, we are dedicated to amplifying Indigenous voice and perspective, improving community relations, correcting the narrative, and making the IU Bloomington campus a more supportive and inclusive place for Native and Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. We encourage everyone to engage with contemporary communities, to learn the histories of the land on which you live and work, to look at who has and does not have access to its resources, and to examine your own place, abilities, and obligations within this process of reparative work. Thank you for joining us this evening for a conversation on islands of resilience, voices making waves. So the format of tonight's program will be an extended conversation between our distinguished guests, and after about 45 minutes, we'll begin answering audience questions. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time, which you can reach by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is the final of 3 programs in the Islands of Resilience Film and Conversation series, curated by David Stringer, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Department of Second Language Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Stringer's research focuses on language acquisition, bilingualism, and endangered languages. His current work examines the links between Indigenous language diversity and the conservation of ecosystems. And he previously curated the series Biocultural Diversity: A Film Journey, which was presented at IU Cinema in fall 2017. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Stringer.
Hello, and welcome to our third and final event in the Film and Conversation series, Islands of Resilience, which is part of IU's themester on the topic of resilience. This film series was born out of a class I teach here at IU called Language Hotspots and Biodiversity, which examines the links between language diversity and biodiversity from a global perspective. Unfortunately, it's also a course about endangered languages in endangered ecosystems. As these are highly correlated geographically, we examine how language and cultural revitalization can be linked to biodiversity conservation. This particular film series, Islands of Resilience, presents us with beautiful visions of struggle, transformation, and reawakening. The island peoples at the heart of these films have their own unique languages and cultures, but the same intimate connection to ancestral environments. In the context of current global destruction of traditional cultures, there are many documentaries made by Western filmmakers about Indigenous communities, which, while often valuable, nevertheless treat such people as other, as objects of study. However, over the last decade or so, there has been an ocean swell of Indigenous filmmaking, which gives center stage to Indigenous voices themselves. In many cultures, storytellers hold a story stick as a sign of their right to speak. It does matter who is holding the stick. For those who missed one or both films, I'd like to recap some of the main themes. The first film, Tana, immerses the viewer in the worldview of a single community in the village of Yakel on the island of Tana in Vanuatu. While the setting is completely local, the themes of forbidden love and defiance of societal norms have universal resonance. The main cast members had never seen a movie of any kind before before making this film. Their first experience of a film was making one. While the story originated from the villagers, the Australian directors served as allies, enabling these voices to be heard. This raises the question of authorship. However, a film is always a collaboration, a product of group creativity. The villagers themselves articulated the plot, served as casting directors, forged the dialogue in their native Nautal language, and played the roles in the film that they play in actual village life. Several actors even kept their own names. Marie Wawa plays Wawa and Mungo Dain plays Dain. The story is based on actual events that took place in the village in 1987. In contrast to Tana's close-up of self-contained indigenous village culture, Vai zooms out to capture a wider panorama of Pacific identity. This ambitious portmanteau project involved 9 female filmmakers, was shot in 7 different Pacific countries, and tells the story of one woman played by 8 actors at 8 different stages of her life. We don't need to see Vi as a single person. Rather, she emerges as an amalgam of female experience in cultures where colonialism has disrupted intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Families are regularly separated as children leave for education or employment, and individuals seek to reconnect with ancestral cultures as they reclaim their heritage. The dialogue is in English, Fijian, Maori, Samoan, and Tongan languages. Gender is a significant theme in both films. Tana documents and poeticizes a tragedy that led to societal transformation for women. Previously, tribal disputes could be resolved by arranged intermarriage, irrespective of the personal feelings of the women concerned. If this seems somehow primitive, recall that not so long ago, this was also true in Europe. Nobody asked 15-year-old Catherine of Aragon if she wanted to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, or later his brother, King Henry VIII. In Tana, the desires of the individual were utterly subsumed by the perceived priority of the well-being of the community. Following the events depicted in this film, the rules were broken and reimagined. A communal decision was reached to respect the right of a woman to refuse subjugation to an unloved groom and her right to choose her own partner. One underlying thread of the narrative is that the resilience of traditional culture can be served by compromise and change from within. Vai also invites us to reconsider questions of gender, not only in the film, but in the filmmaking process itself. It served as a platform for female empowerment at every stage of production. Vai also engages in deep reflection on ethnicity. The writers and directors are all New Zealanders with Indigenous ancestral links to each of the Pacific Islands where they set their stories. One thing I love about Vai is that it intelligently eschews simplistic notions of racial or ethnic purity. Several vignettes implicitly acknowledge the intricacy of contemporary identity in communities that have been transformed by colonialism. And this sense of complexity is enhanced, I think, by the frequent shifts in location and language. So both films invite the audience to consider issues of gender, ethnic identity, cultural change, and cultural reconnection in societies continually threatened by the forces of colonialization, capitalism, and globalization. Before we begin our conversation tonight, let's have another look at the trailers for the 2 films, Tana and Vai.
Lugunalim rồi nhé các nếu ấy
Ay, mami matunga asogul ya amalangin. Ay tun penggelik ni nabi ala ila.
Kini mer golan mkalba. Kena ini paadun menaikkan tu kan orang betul nak Hawaii golin fa Manila.
wow dari mana simen yang kami ngal belakang migo
Te pano pen.
Aho nei to mo e koe longa tau tupe. Si pore a ke whakaonga. Whano si liu mai. Whano si liu mai.
Moses said, when I go to school, I won't have any friends.
You know what? Moses is a bloody kakamora.
No, but what I will do is teach you how to use your own beautiful voice.
Vi, you could do amazing things for your people, but you need to cut out all these distractions.
I know what I'm capable of, but you just won't listen to me.
So this is what she learned at that Flats University, how to cause trouble. You have these thoughts.
These thoughts, they're my own Elvis. My family, my village has sacrificed so much for me to be here, and I'm not going to waste that. I'll not allow you to take any more from us!
Koe mga hoa ni, ke lele ya koe mamea.
I'm tired of molding myself to become who you want me to be. My name is Vaisea. Vaisea lona lote pulusi.
So now that we have had our memories refreshed, let's meet our guests for this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to extend a virtual welcome to three very special guests tonight, for whom it's actually tomorrow morning or this afternoon from a Bloomington perspective. Matasila Freshwater directed the Solomon Islands fishing scene in Bai. Mata is a writer-director with a background in anthropology, film, and animation. She's passionate about exploring cultural complexities through storytelling. She's well known for her original work in animation. Her credits include award-winning animated short Schmidt and the horror series Tana. She was voted 2019 New Filmmaker of the Year by the Screen Production and Development Association of New Zealand. Mata has origins in Nusa Hope, as well as other communities around the Roviana Lagoon in the western province of the Solomon Islands. Marina Alofagia McCartney directed the Samoan ceremony scene in Vai. Marina has had a wide-ranging career in fashion, film, and academia. She holds an MA in screen production and is an award-winning filmmaker and teaching fellow at Pacific Studies, the University of Auckland. Previous shorts that were very noteworthy included Granda and Milk and Honey. Marina made the interesting and difficult, but hopefully rewarding decision to go back to school and do a PhD. In her current doctoral studies at Auckland University of Technology, she explores Moana Pacifica identity and filmmaking. Last but certainly not least, our very own Natasha Saelua has just this semester defended her doctoral dissertation in higher education and student affairs here at Indiana University, Bloomington. Hooray! Just like our other two guests, it's difficult to put a label on Natasha. She's a woman of many talents. Among her other achievements, she's a founding board member of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, a national advocacy organization. She's joining us today from Hawaii, where she's working as a researcher for an organization called Regional Educational Laboratory Pacific, or REL Pacific. REL or R-E-L?
Rel.
REL. REL Pacific serves educators in American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, Guam, Hawaii, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. To address the priorities and interests of these jurisdictions, REL Pacific works in partnership with school districts, state departments of education, and others to use data and research to improve academic outcomes for Pacific Islander students. Natasha will share perspectives, her perspectives today as a member of the IU campus community, and also from this Samoan diaspora. So, welcome everybody. We can relax into a conversation now. Let's start with you, Mata.
Uh-oh.
Could you tell us a little bit about what brought you to make Vi, what the experience was like of collaborating with all these wonderful women filmmakers, and what it meant to you?
Yeah, well, I think that, well, hello everyone in the ether as well. Yeah, I think that everyone should make their first feature film with 8 other women as directors. Honestly, like, it was also my first live action. So I went into this full of fear and insecurity, and a lot of that to do with my cultural identity, my identity as a woman, all of the things that make you feel like you are unworthy. And then just to have 8 other women feeling the same things but advocating for you and cheering you on, and yeah, it was incredible. It's been one of the most formative experiences I've ever had in film, and it's gifted me a lot, and I loved it.
I think in the credits it might have been you who, among other acknowledgements, gave a shout out to your Vi sisters. I think that was
For
you.
sure. Yeah, I think so. And also our beautiful Sharon wrote, I think it was ended with what she said, calling us warrior women and all the women warrior women, and it was stunning, and yeah, very cool.
Great. Marina, if I could put the same question to you, how did you get involved with Vi? What was the collaborative experience like, and how did it affect you as a filmmaker?
I had actually stopped making films for about 5 years before Vi. I made the last little film I made was called Milk and Honey, and the year that started screening and it started doing the festival rounds, my parents died within 3 weeks of each other, and we, my siblings and I, nursed them. It was a pretty intense experience, and then almost a year to the day after my mother passed, I had my daughter, Elena. So I went back to university to teach, and that's where I started out in Pacific Studies teaching. And I actually thought I wasn't going to make any more films. I thought that was it for me. I'd kind of lost my creative juice. And Vi came along, and I wasn't even going to apply for it or put in an expression of interest, and I literally wrote something on the day it was due. So and yeah, just like Mata, you know, I went into Vi with all of these insecurities because I was telling a Samoan story, and I can't speak Samoan fluently. So, you know, it was, am I worthy enough as a Samoan woman? I haven't made anything for 5 years. Am I the weakest creative link as well? There are all of these insecurities. And what's come out of Vi has been, it's strengthened some existing friendships. One of my other best friends ended up on Vai as well. So that's Nicole Whippy and her sister Sharon Whippy. Nicole literally lives 100 meters down the road from me. And so that strengthened that relationship. And then I've made some other really strong, beautiful friendships as well. One with Matasila, who I annoy on a weekly basis with phone calls about various things. Yeah, it was an incredible experience. And I think what it also proved was, I guess, considering where Pacific women are in our society in New Zealand, and we sit on the lower part of a lot of the statistics in New Zealand. It really proved to me what can happen when a group of Moana Pacifica women can get together, and we're actually much stronger than the sum of our weaknesses when we come together.
And you made a fantastic job of directing your part of the film. I found it incredibly moving. So it just goes to show, you had all of this left inside you waiting to come out. Really, it's great. Natasha, like me, you're a viewer of these films rather than a filmmaker, but you've spent a lifetime thinking and writing about Pacifica identity. What were your impressions of both of these films, and what did they mean to you?
Alofagia, thank you so much for the question. I'm really honored to be here. My initial impressions of the film, we all watch films from the lens of, our own identities and experiences. So as I watched, and to be honest, rewatched some of them, I viewed them as, a Samoan woman, a Pacific Islander in diaspora, as you mentioned. And, just to, firstly, to see people who look like me on the screen, I can't even really describe what that's like. If you grew up in the US in the late 20th and early 20th century, you're a Pacific Islander, well, I have a complicated relationship with film because so much of the representation of the Pacific draws upon these really old school, honestly, these racist and sexist narratives, like the lovely hula hands or these ultra masculine sort of figures and features. I remember my parents loved watching Elvis Presley's Blue Hawaii. And so it was like, think those kinds of films that I saw a lot of growing up. So I remember watching some of the Pacific films when I was a college student, Whale Rider. Many years later, fast forward to just a few years ago, the Disney movie Moana, just being completely overwhelmed, where I can finally see myself represented, someone I knew, be it like a student struggling, mothers balancing difficult decisions, elders sharing knowledge to a privileged few. So, I'm sitting with how important films can be and the power to tell our own stories. There's this, in education, there's this Indigenous theorist, Brian Brayboy, and he talks about how our stories are our theories about the world, our realities. And so film is yet another way we can transmit those stories. So, I'm just really thinking about like so many different things, migration for one, on my own experience, my father being in the military and me, like how does a Samoan woman end up in Indiana University or in the Midwest? And in the context of many, many more Pacific Islanders moving to the Midwest, for education, for job opportunities. I think about the parallels I saw with Pacific identity, young Pacific women growing up in the context of US racialization or histories that commemorate colonization, and how a lot of that intersects with my own work. So I'll pause there.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Natasha. I'm going to sort of zoom in and zoom out a little bit with these questions, to borrow a metaphor. I'd like to go back to some bigger general questions later, but just in case we don't have time, I'd love to take the opportunity to ask each guest a more specific question that they can answer from a personal perspective. So, so Mata, to go back to you, I really, really loved your section of the film. It touched me in multiple ways. First of all, could you talk just about your experience of going from working predominantly in animation projects to live action? What was it like actually filming that? What did it take to film that short scene?
Oh my gosh. It's quite, the differences should be really obvious, but I guess it wasn't really to me. I think the most significant thing is just the physical mechanics around everything and the detail that needs to go into it. Like, I had all these ideas for shot types, and with animation, you have a camera that you can move around a space anywhere, right? And they're like, no, Mata, we're gonna need a crane. I'm like, oh, okay. And in order to film it on water, we need to build a scaffold. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then we need to get a canoe, and then we need to anchor the canoe so it doesn't float away from us in the water. And I'm like, yeah, great, okay, this all makes sense. And then we need a boat for me to sit in. You know, like all these mechanics that I think when you're, I guess when my frame of reference is animation, everything can be done and everything can be controlled. I didn't really take any of that into account when writing this. I think that's also a good thing too, because it means that you sit in the story rather than do the producing job, which is think about all the mechanics that go around it and all the structures that go around it. But yeah, there's some really beautiful and happy accidents that come from live action that you don't get in animation. I think animation, I always talk about animation having like this really lovely life brought to it in every stage, but you always kind of know what's going to happen because you do your edit up front, and that's what everything is based off. Whereas in live action, it's like an orchestra, and you practice and you have all these things that are going, and then you hope that that beautiful crescendo happens. But then there are things that you can't control, like these are one take shots, right? And so we're sitting on top of the water, it's midday, I've called cut for every take that I've done because things aren't working, and the team are like, we need to get one full take, Mata, so we have the film. Okay, great. And so we're just about to get into another shot, and then this boat just like drives along the horizon in the distance, and you're like, the waves are going to come. The waves are going to come anytime now. And in the script I had written it as this perfect stillness, but in the film the canoes start bashing each other, and it's like the bashing she's like doing at the beginning with the hermit crab and the rock, and it's this conflict that I didn't write in that just added to their relationship and in the moment that was happening. And that was the one, like when that happened, it was the perfect take, and I couldn't have predicted that, and animation wouldn't have allowed that to happen. Yeah.
And here's me thinking that the clashing of the boats was totally scripted and deliberate.
Definitely intentional.
Because it worked. I found this scene very moving because a lot of people can relate to things in this movie, even if they're not female or even if they're not Pacific Islanders. Many families experience separation. All of us experience separation in our relationships. And some of us do end up talking to people who are not there, having conversations with somebody you last spoke to 5 years ago while doing the dishes in the kitchen. People, we talk to parents who may have passed on. We talk to friends we haven't seen for a while. I love how poetic your segment is because it keeps everything ambiguous. Does Vi's mother come to visit her? Is she not really there? Is she a figment of Vi's imagination? Is she talking to her mother even though her mother isn't there? Or on some sort of spiritual level, has the spirit of her mother somehow come to visit her across the waves? How conscious was all of this when you were designing it? Did you have a particular meaning in mind or a theme in mind about what was going to play out there?
Yeah, definitely. I think as mixed people, so my ancestry is to the Solomon Islands, but also to England through my dad. And I think there's a lot of internal conflict that is always rumbling underneath the surface. And I think the ocean as a symbol does that all too. I think it's very dissonant in that it's calm and it's raging, and that it's deep and that it's shallow, and that it's all these it's life, it's death, it's all these things. And so I think as I grow older, I'm sort of learning how to be more comfortable with my own dissonance and how I can harbor both and all those things simultaneously and still be a semi-functioning human. And so for me, that's all part of that story, the dissonance and the character, the dissonance and their setting, the dissonance in their background and the relationship. And so to me, it's both and all the things, you know, she is there, she isn't there, she is dead, she is alive. And so I don't think I'm going to answer your question in the fact that's, you know, the grey area is my life.
And that's the way it should be, but I had to ask. Okay, Marina, if I could turn to you. In a previous short of yours, Granda, I think, there's a young Samoan man who's trying to connect with his grandfather. And in this Samoan ceremony scene here, Vi returns to Samoa after many years away, and she's trying to reconnect with her culture and with her people after having experienced a sense of disconnection. So is there a link between these two themes, and is it a personal link? Are you trying to, is there something personal underlying this exploration of the desire and the determination to reconnect with grandparents and ancestral cultures?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I only just recently realized, like we're talking probably in the last 2 months, that nearly every film I've made, not that I have a huge body of work yet, has been autobiographical. There's been an autobiographical element there. So Granda was based on my experiences of meeting my Samoan Granda. And I even find the word Granda interesting because that's actually my Geordie father's influence. And we applied that to my Samoan grandfather. That film was based on that experience, and Vi is an amalgamation of experiences, but maybe the best way to describe it is to try and talk as briefly as I can, because I am a talker, of how I came up with the idea for that particular story. So in terms of my lineage or my heritage, so my grandmother is the daughter of the paramount chief within the district of Palauli, and my grandfather had the title of Asiata, the chiefly title of Asiata, and Asiata is the only title in Samoa that has both what we call tumua malipule, so authority, political authority from the point of view of an orator on both Upolu and Savaii. So I have this particular lineage, and I had a mother. My mother was the first of 2 women to have a chiefly title in our district of Satupaitea in Savaii, Samoa. And she was one of the cultural custodians within the family, and yet she never taught us how to speak Samoan. So it's been a struggle for me, and it will continue to be a struggle for me about how worthy I am as a Samoan woman. And because I don't speak my language fluently. So with Vi, we all went to it was a writing retreat, and some of us knew each other. It was the first time to meet others, and we were there for, I think it might have been 6 days. And I came with another story that I wanted to explore, which was actually set in the space after death. I was interested in what might happen when Vi died, because in Samoan Indigenous belief or spirituality, when one dies, their spirits travel to the easternmost part of Samoa, Savaii, and there's a village there, Falealupo, and the spirits leap off sort of a group of rocks there and into the ocean. And that's where they enter Pulotu, which is the Samoan Elysium. So I was interested in that, but I got challenged by one of the other women, one of our other Vai women who has Samoan ancestry. And it kind of went in this spiral for me where I started thinking I'm not worthy enough as a Samoan woman to tell this story. I'm the weakest creative link here. And we had to deliver our 10-page script the next morning, 9 o'clock the next morning. And I just remember thinking, my idea's just been smashed to bits. I've got no story. And I remember towards the end of the day, I went and had a shower, and I was standing in the shower and I knew I needed to cry. And I tried screwing up my face, all of this type of stuff, nothing would happen. And then I just went, Mum, like that. And I burst into tears and I said, why didn't you teach me Samoan? And keeping in mind my mum had passed so 2012, so 4 years previously. And that's when the waterworks came. And then I went to my room and I got ready for bed and I set my alarm for 4 a.m. thinking, right, we have to deliver the script at 9, that's 5 hours, that's 2 pages an hour. And I had just started meditating 6 weeks before. And I'd usually just sit there, breathe in, breathe out, that type of thing. But I sat down and for some reason, I don't know why, I just went, I call upon Sa Molioi, which is my family in Situaitia. I call upon my Lelesi Wau line, which is my Paloli line. I call upon my Cook Island ancestors, my stepmother's ancestors. I call upon my Palangi ancestors, my white ancestors from my dad, if you're out there, this type of thing. Please, if there's a story you think I should tell, please bring it to me. And God, if you think that I'm ready for that story, please open up my heart to receive it. And I went to bed. And at 3:06 in the morning, I woke up like this. And I had that story, and I wrote that story. And it's really been a life-changing spiritual experience for me as well, because most mornings I wake at 5, and I now call it tapuai, to worship, where I call on my ancestors. So that was sort of the start of that experience. But I just think, I mean, hopefully that story illustrates all of the complexities that one might have with identity, even when it comes to telling a story for film. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing so much of that with us. I'd like to get to Natasha, but I'd also like, if you wouldn't mind waiting, Natasha, just to stay with you for a minute, Marina, just to pursue this a little further. First of all, that sounded like a fantastic first idea, actually, for a way to end the film.
It's actually my next film. It's my next short now. So, yeah.
But I didn't want to leave tonight without acknowledging the actor Fiona Collins, who plays Vi in that scene. You just described a whole world of emotions, and I guess you were happy because I think those emotions are all visible in the face of this incredible actor. I don't know how much direction you gave her, but she brought so much to that. In an article I wrote for a local arts magazine, The Rider, last week, I talk about how the cinematography of both Tana and Vi is amazing. Some of the best camera work is actually close-ups of faces, actually, in Vi, or following in the individuals, characters, not just scenery. And the character really lingers on her face. Did you give her a lot of direction, or did you just tell her the story and let her run with it?
We talked a lot. We had conversations beforehand just about identity. So I guess my way of trying to direct is to have those conversations beforehand. And I think, and touching on what Natasha said earlier about seeing yourself on screen, when you have a Samoan who is writing a story and you've got a Samoan playing the character in that story, I mean, the hope is that there is an element of truth, right, to that story that your actress will connect with. And I don't know, there aren't we don't have yet a long history of stories that have been written by Samoan, Tongans, Solomon Islanders, Kukiairani, that Samoans, Tongans, Kukiairani, Solomon Islanders, Fijians, etc., can play. So I think that, and Fiona, she's the only trained, she was the only trained actress to play Vai. All of the other leads were played by non-actors. I mean, full credit to every single one of the other women who directed their non-actor leads. But I think because, and I'm assuming because they can connect to the themes within each vignette, that is the reason why they were able to bring an element of truth to their character. That makes sense.
Yeah, the predominance of non-actors in both these films, in Tana and Vai, is really kind of amazing. You feel like you're witnessing the birth of something new. Keen observers will note the presence in your scene, though, of Frankie Adams, who plays Bobby Draper in the sci-fi TV show The Expanse. She's quite well known here in the States. I'd like to move to Natasha, if that's okay. Although you may be dying to come back with something about the previous discussion. I don't know.
Oh yes, but let's continue.
Because I know this is very meaningful to you too. But among other things, so education and educational research is a major area of expertise for you. And one part of this movie that I think is very moving, I think, to a lot of people, is that of the story of a Samoan-born, New Zealand-born Samoan who's going to college in New Zealand and sending money home to her family and struggling to make ends meet and juggle the various commitments of work and study and loyalty to her family. And so it's a theme. It's one theme that is also elsewhere in other parts of the film. There's a pressure on many Pacific Islanders to leave home in search of education overseas. Families raise money to help people leave in the hope that they will come back. Mm-hmm. But they don't always come back. There are Pacific Islander communities now in many countries of the world. So I'd like you to share, if you would, Natasha, I'd be very grateful if you could share with us your insights on educational opportunities for Pacific Islanders in the US. What do people in such communities see in terms of pressures to assimilate, in terms of issues of inclusion and opportunities? On how a sense of belonging is or is not fostered on US campuses.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that really dovetails with my own research, looking at, culturally relevant and culturally responsive campus environments. Think about that faculty person, Vi goes to the faculty person asking, for some support, with her assignment, and, the faculty person sort of comes back to her asking her, you need to prioritize college, you have to set aside these other obligations. And that's actually it's a very common idea, common theory in my field in higher ed, that a student has to put aside all of their other distractions if they want to succeed in college. And in response to that, a lot of critical scholars have really pushed back on that. In reality, that's just not possible for Pacific people, for a lot of people. For Pacific people especially, we're communal people, we draw strength from each other. So, if you reimagine that scene where Vi approaches her teacher, she asks for some leeway with school support, and that teacher not only understands, but can also connect her to her community on campus, the Office of Pacific Equity, or to a Pacific student advisor, or to a student organization. So, really flipping that around to think about the onus is on the campus to transform and support the student, not for the student to transform and fit the campus. And that's true, that idea is true for any student. Think about, a student who comes from rural Indiana, who may have never left their county at all, and who's, comes to IU for the first time, and that being such a transformative and difficult experience. They're away from home, they're away from family. You know, so a lot of the research that I've been looking at is looking at, you know, what are the environments that support Pacific Islander students, and with the organization that I work with EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, you know, we're looking at like leadership programs, for example, leadership programs for college students, where for some of them they may not have access to ethnic studies classes where they might be able to read about or learn about Pacific history, but they have access to community elders, or, you know, to these other spaces where they can see people who look like them, see people in many different fields or professions. So I think, you know, when I think about the through line of, you know, my own life and my own scholarship is just really, and a lot of that being based on my own experience. And you know, I think for sure, I know that films like Tana can definitely be another way to support our Pacific students to see themselves on screen, to see their stories on screen, and that, you know, none of us are one single story, right? We're all made up of all of these unique experiences that bring us to where we are, and that our people have survived. There's this term survival and resistance. You know, our people have survived a lot of things and can continue to survive these things. So that's, you know, sort of the thrust of my own research, my own personal interest too.
Cool.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, congratulations on becoming Dr. Saelua.
Thank you.
That's wonderful news. I knew it was happening around now, but it must have just happened, right?
Yeah, it was last month. Yeah.
Last month. Okay, great.
Am I able to just respond to Dr. Saelua, what she said? I am going to call you doctor. It's very worthy of you. So what you're saying, right? I mean, so Amberley's piece, that particular New Zealand-born piece, that was based upon Amberley's experiences in tertiary education. So, and with her studying film. And I think if you also look at the creative aesthetics in that particular vignette too, it is the only vignette where water isn't heavily present. So to me, it speaks to this disconnect. She's literally a fish out of water in that environment. It's a very stark, cold interior compared to all the other, you know, environments within Vai as well. And you know, that experience that Amberley had is not unique, as Dr. Saelua was saying. It's not a unique experience, and this happens a lot. So I just wanted to add to that.
Thank you. And I'll actually use that moment to pivot, because I have a whole bunch of questions. I would love just to, you know, go for a coffee with the three of you and listen to what you have to say all day long. But time is short. So I think even though I do have more questions, I'd like to shift to a different stage of the conversation and give you the opportunity to ask questions of each other, or questions or comments, if you like. And I can step in because I have got other things we can talk about, but I'd like to pass the story stick, as it were, and give you the chance to talk to each other if you have questions for each other about either film or both films, or about any of the other issues that have come up in the conversation. Matt is trying to hide. There's nowhere for you to hide.
Someone else go first. We're just going to sit in silence.
Well, I can continue, but I want you to feel free to jump in with comments and questions for each other at any point. But let me throw out another question into the space.
Fantastic.
So let's compare Tana and Vai as models of Indigenous filmmaking. So some international critics had a go at Tana, saying that it was just a version of Romeo and Juliet, or that the Australian filmmakers were indulging in exoticism. I take exception to these kinds of criticism, actually, because the people from the village who were telling their own story had never read Romeo and Juliet, were unfamiliar with the Western canon, hadn't seen a movie before. If anything, it points to the universality of the stories that we humans tell each other, right? Of the universality of myths. Is that the same stories pop up all over the world in different communities. Romeo and Juliet is just a version of what happened in Tana, right? So I find this kind of criticism annoying because cinema should allow you to see the world through somebody else's eyes. And that clearly isn't happening with this kind of film criticism. As for exoticism, this is a kind of a harder question. Is this an Australian film? Is this a film from Vanuatu? The film directors, at least one of the directors moved to Vanuatu with his kids. His kids lived in the village for almost a year. He asked them what stories they wanted to tell, but it's still very much an Australian film production because the villages didn't have film production. So Vai and Tana present very different models of Indigenous filmmaking, and I would love it if you could comment on that. To what extent do you think filmmakers can give voice to Indigenous communities that might not otherwise be heard? Mata, would you like to now that you're not trying to hide anymore, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that in terms of, I think the filmmakers approach Tana in a really well thought out way. It's hard not to, for me as an Indigenous filmmaker, to not want to rip it apart in some way, because it's having Australia herald it without a lot of the performers and Indigenous people being part of Australia feels like a version of colonization acting out even the privilege that a person has to be able to take themselves out of their life to go back and live in a village. And there is a lot of privilege and a lot of agency there that, like, I don't get to do that as a brown filmmaker. I don't get to necessarily go back to my village easily without the support of a huge production to fund that, and so I think it is a really amazing story, but I also think it's worthy of interrogation. And we've been talking a lot about sovereignty and story sovereignty, and what does that look like, and how does that look like throughout the entire process of filmmaking, not just in its development and creation stages, but who gets final say, what's its life when beyond it being packaged, and we don't have all the answers to that now, and it is a stepping stone in a journey. But also I've been thinking about what Fred Renata, one of our Māori cinematographers, had said on Hui on a call I was on the other day, where he said that we've inherited a film language, and so for Indigenous filmmakers, regardless of whether we're aware of the canons that we're participating in or not, our stories are always going to be told through a lens that isn't ours, because we're using a language that we didn't invent or that we didn't come up with, and that we have to find ourselves in. We have to subvert, we have to explore. And I think that is a really exciting thing, especially if we look at the sort of amazing genre films that are coming out that get to subvert past stereotypes of how Indigenous and brown and queer people have been treated on screen. But it does mean that I think we need more ability to take the helms to be able to control that, because we need to discover that for ourselves. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that. Marina, did you want to weigh in on this at all?
Yeah, I mean, Tana is such a beautiful film. Like the cinematography is incredible. And like Mata said, I thought that the filmmakers approached the story in a really considered way, and as respectful as they could. And because you have a community that hasn't engaged in the medium of film before, it's an important film because it also captures their life on screen, and that is a visual document of a story that they have heavily collaborated with the filmmakers on. As Mata was saying, one of the big conversations that is happening in Indigenous film at the moment is around this idea of story sovereignty. So, just thinking about things like who owns the intellectual property of the film. So one of the things I looked at as the credits ran for Tana was who is acknowledged as the director, who's acknowledged as the writer. And there are no Vanuatu people acknowledged in those particular roles, and Tana was nominated for an Academy Award, right? So whose names are being nominated in association with the film? And these are just conversations that are happening now. So, and again, as Mata said, I don't have the answers to this. It's such a complex thing. How do you correct 100 and something years of a particular medium that has packaged us and constructed who we are and then presented it to the West for consumption? It's not going to be solved overnight. By the same, token, we still need allies as well in this when it comes to making films. So it's a really complex issue, but I mean, I think Tana is certainly one of the better stories being told by people outside of the community. Yeah.
It should also be noted that they're acknowledged. The villages are acknowledged not at the credits at the end, but at the very beginning of the film. So the film was co-created and co-written by the villages, and in interviews, the directors give credit as well. One concern I have is how much if a culture doesn't have a film industry and doesn't have a means of creating their own stories in this medium. One concern I have is how much does going into a community like that and making a film like this change the community irrevocably? It's the story of one of the actors I find very touching. Mungo Dain, who plays the main male role in the film, was chosen unanimously by the villagers to play that part because he was considered the most handsome man in the village. Nobody argued with that. And then he lived in this village all of his life, but then soon he was on the road. He went to Australia, he went to Venice, he went to Los Angeles for the Oscars. How much would that have changed him over the course of his life? We won't know, because just a couple of years after the film was made, he died. He went back to relatively normal village life and was doing seasonal fruit picking. He got a wound, it went septic, and he died at the age of 24. It's hard for people to know from the outside what it means for a community like that, to go from never having seen a film before to seeing somebody like Mungo Dain immortalized in celluloid at the age of 24. It's hard to know what that means, but certainly change has been affected. And who knows what the consequences are for a community like that. Natasha, we just have time for you to weigh in on this before we go back to Brittany, who's going to deal with the Q&A. He's going to help us with the Q&A. So Natasha, do you have any final comments?
Yeah.
What do you think about the story sovereignty in relation to these two films?
No, I really appreciate it, and I'm struck by that, by that story of the, I'm just thinking about it's like it goes both ways. Is like this film world, which I hardly know, but the film world sort of impacting the people of Tana, and then also how much of his presence in those spaces for so short a time, how much did that impact the people who were able to meet him and interact him, and their understanding or awareness of Indigenous people expand that much more. I'm also sort of thinking about you know, I lived in LA for about 15 years. And so when I, you know, people talk about the industry or whatever, like that was like, you know, people who were connected to the industry or the film. And I know that there's a particular kind of industry that they're talking about in Hollywood in particular, but I'm also thinking about, you know, my mom pointed out to me a couple of years ago, there's these Samoan dramas that are being like filmed and posted on YouTube. They're hours long, they're super intense, and they're very personal stories, just written and directed and filmed, starring people, by people, for people. So that, you know, if we're talking about film and the creation of film to tell stories, like it's happening. It's just not happening in certain spaces, but it's definitely happening. Like why TikTok has proliferated in Pacific communities too, and you know, being able to like in these other quick bites and be able to continue to tell these stories. So I think that there's layers of where, you know, Indigenous people are claiming spaces and will continue to. So I'll stop there.
Well, at this point, I'll take the opportunity to say thank you so much to the three of you for joining us. It's been a real honor and a privilege to have you here with us live at IU Cinema. I'm eternally grateful. And at this point, I will hand it back over to Brittany.
Thanks, David, and thank you all. And thank you, audience members, for submitting your questions. We'll get to those in a second, but I just want to let you know there is still time to submit a question, which you can do so by typing in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. First up, Will asks for Mata and Marina, what part of the production of your segment were you most stressed about before filming, and how did you overcome it when shooting?
Marina, you go.
Well, definitely the first, you know, trying to come up with the idea for the story, as I mentioned earlier, but also, so I'm a single mother and my daughter was 4 years old and she is actually in the film. She's the little whalangi looking girl that runs up to the grandmother, and I put her in there on purpose. Well, actually, yeah, on purpose, one, so that her airfare could be paid by production. And, but also it was this idea of, because she's very white looking, she has blonde hair, and sort of, you know, I wanted to kind of pose a question without it being on the nose, but what does a Samoan look like? Who gets to decide who is Samoan and who isn't? Because my daughter speaks Samoan. She's been going to a Samoan, she started at Samoan daycare and now she's in a Samoan unit. But having her on set, that was actually really, really stressful, trying to figure out how I would balance that, but also because I wanted her with me. Even though I knew it was going to be really hard, to not have her there would have been harder. And my experience isn't unique either. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Pacific women and Māori women are more likely to be single mothers than any other ethnic group. So we were just really lucky that we had an incredible, two incredible producers, husband and wife team, Kyle McNaughton and Kerry Wakia. Kerry's Papua New Guinean descent and Kyle is tangata whenua Māori, and they understood that and they supported that. And I don't know how many other productions in New Zealand would have done that. They even flew in one of my first cousin, who was in American Samoa at the time, they flew her in and put her up in the hotel with me so that she could take care of my daughter on set. So my daughter was on set the whole time, which was, yeah, but also amazing. That was the hardest thing.
Mata, your experience?
I mean, it's a long story. There's a lot of difficulties and like really amazing learning in beautiful ways. One involving me wandering around a hotel barefoot, attempting to go into people's rubbish because I lost a prop. But I think the biggest thing was that we've got a no-cut cut in it. So we have the drama on top and then she does a dive underwater, and that's 2 locations. And the Solomons at the time, they've only just now started doing the roads up a little bit better. So we're driving through potholes that would usually take maybe like a 15-minute drive into like a 40-minute drive to each location. We have 1 day to shoot the entire drama. The day that we had scheduled to get the underwater scene, because I got 2 days. We got rained out, couldn't do it, wasn't going to happen. Next day, we shoot the drama on top of the water. Beautiful day, amazing. And then we reach the end of the day and I don't have a shot that I need. And I'm like begging the producers and saying, please, she deserves it. She's done such an amazing job. We need that underwater shot. And the producer's like, yeah, of course. Like, we have a flight out tomorrow. So we're going to go in the early morning, skeleton crew. We're going to get that shot. And so I got to, you know, see the sun rise at a World War II shipwreck with a skeleton crew of a story that I had written. And that was beautiful, you know, that was such a wonderful thing. And even though it was not what was planned in the schedule, and a boat didn't show up, so we had to borrow a canoe from one of the locals on the beach, it was perfect and beautiful. And we got our plane and got very, very drunk on the plane.
But it's also one of the most beautiful shots in the film as well.
And all of that, and it was made possible by all of that. So
worth the fight.
That's extraordinary. Kathy asks, how much freedom did you each have to determine the trajectory of Vi's life in your segment?
Heaps. Hey, Mata, we had a lot of freedom. I mean, obviously there were particular connectors. You know, we were given guidelines, I guess, that we had to stick to. You know, it had to be shot in one continuous shot. It had to include water in some way as a theme. It had to have an actress who was Indigenous to that particular island that we were shooting in. We had 1 day to rehearse, 1 day to film. So there were all these creative guidelines that we had to meet. But in terms of our stories, we were given a lot of freedom. And then we just tracked certain things, you know, like if there was a brother in the mum's, you know, inside mum was carrying a baby brother at the beginning of Vi, where does he reappear? You know, what about the ages throughout, that type of thing? Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Mata?
Yeah, definitely. I think the parameters that the producers have put on it gave it a form and a structure, and then we were really allowed to like flex that in a lot of ways. And I think and that all came from the conversations that we had and the back and forth in our process, and crying constantly. But also like you're saying, we're forming, like challenging each other on our stories and trying to make them as robust as possible. And yeah, so a lot of flexibility, which gave us a lot of ownership and but a lot of comfort too, I think, because we were all sort of going through the same process together.
Olivia asks, the kava cutting scene is short, but speaks much about the desire for peace. Pairing that with the emotional moment that follows after finding the father's digging stick, they contrast each other when the desire for revenge is uttered. Can you speak about that?
I mean, I know that ava, we call it ava in Samoa. Ava came from a spiritual creation. So there's a spiritual element to it, and I can't remember the entire story, but I can't speak to what it means in Vanuatu, but I remember seeing that scene and thought that it was really interesting that it was used to nurture peace, because from memory in Samoan Indigenous stories, one of the boys or the sons of one of the other, I can't remember his relation to Tangaloa, but his body broke in half. And so there was an act of violence that happened, and it was something to do with the ava that brought it back together. I'm sorry if I'm getting the story wrong. So I was actually interested in the connections between the spiritual connotations of other in Samoa and how they connect to that idea of peace in Vanuatu. But yeah, anyway, that's a complete aside, probably didn't answer the question.
Next question. Someone asks, when you think of VAI, what do you think is most dynamic about its impact when considering the history of films centered around Pacific Islanders and their variety of cultures?
Mata, do you want to go? Otherwise, I'll just keep on talking.
Oh, you take this, girl. You got this.
Oh, no, go on. Well, I'll just put this out there. When VAI made its debut, and so it did this at the Berlinale, at the Berlin Film Festival in February 2019, there had only been 3 fictional feature films to date directed by Moana Pacifica females in New Zealand. There had only been 2 credited Moana Pacifica female producers and writers. I think there had only been 1 or 2. So VAI made history, right? It was the first time in the history of Aotearoa New Zealand that a fictional feature film had Moana Pacifica females occupying all 3 above the line roles, so producer, director, writer, and with a Moana Pacifica in the lead roles. And that's the reality, that was the reality of filmmaking for women of Moana Pacifica descent in Aotearoa. So when I think of VAI, I think about the ceilings it broke. And I'm really proud of my involvement in it. And I'm also really proud of all the women in it as well, because some of them had never made a live action film before, Mata being one of them. Some of them had written plays and directed plays, but they'd never been involved in moving image. So again, you know, it's really amazing what can happen when you bring a group of Indigenous women together and you give them the talking stick.
Yeah.
Mata, did you want to?
I just want to say, yeah, totally, exactly that. And I think if we look at what Kerry and Kyle have done, the producers of VAI, the producers of Waru, and they have a follow-up to this, Kainga, which is the anthology for Pan-Asian women. They have really challenged New Zealand's funding bodies in terms of who can have the right to tell the story and what. It is just trusting us to tell our own stories, because a lot of the skills we can learn when we're there and when we have the right people around us.
Yeah. When we have the right people around us, totally. Yeah. It's really important.
Kathy asks, Marina, could you please talk about the ritual VAI was leading in your segment? It seems to reference death, but is also very joyous.
Okay. So it's a ritual we call ta'alolo from memory, and it's for the opening of a church or a jubilee of a church, that type of thing. And VAI's her role is as Taupo. So the Taupo is the ceremonial hostess. She's usually the daughter of the paramount chief, either within a village or within the larger district, depending on the event and where it's held. My mother had many instances where she had danced, and as I mentioned, my grandmother was Taupo for Baloli. But I have always had an insecurity about being able to siva Samoa, and part of that is to dance. And part of that is my mum established the Samoan cultural group at my high school. And I remember being in that group, and while I enjoyed the first year, by the second year, I remember we were talking about who would be the taupo for the group, and my name was put forward at one point, and being the not full Samoan, I guess, that was shot down by some of the other women, and I stopped dancing. I only recently did a Siva Samoa, so that's only 5 years ago in high school. But yeah, so I was really interested in what would happen if a Samoan woman, because she's kind of based on my mum, even though my mum would definitely have no problem getting out there and dancing. But if she went back to Samoa after being away for a long, long time, and she was suddenly thrust into that role that she used to do a long, long time ago, how would she feel? So it was kind of an amalgamation of my experiences, what I would imagine for my mum, thinking about my sister being in that role. But yeah, usually the taupo leads, you know, she's there in it's a very, very important role in Samoan culture.
Thank you for illuminating more. I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Dylan asks, somewhat relatedly, what advice do you have for Pacifica students who have grown up in areas without many Pacifica resources or representation, such as Indiana, and may struggle with thoughts of self-worth or not being worthy enough to connect to their Pacifica heritage? And Natasha, I'd love if you could get to maybe start this one to kick us off.
I'd love to. Talofa Dylan, it's so good to connect with you again on the webinar. I think like both Marina and Mata shared, I also have, I think, been sitting with, sort of like these lifelong identity sort of questions, and, belonging, not having been raised in the islands and yet feeling a very strong connection to my culture. So I remember reading, I think it was Selena Tusitala March, who talks about how when she started to, she's a scholar, a Pacific Studies scholar and writer. And I'm forgetting where I read this, but when she was worried about, should I continue writing about this topic? It was about, I think it was about Samoan community, or I can't remember. And she goes to Albert Wenz and she asks him, like, I don't think I don't think it's my role to, I don't deserve to, I shouldn't. And Albert Wenz looks at her, he's just like, go do the thing, and I think it just sort of, and he sort of continued, like, this is, if you can accept your responsibility as a Pacific Islander, as a Samoan, and, you have some understanding or awareness that that's like a lifelong responsibility. Like we also have some agency in that too, so we can decide, it's my culture too. I have some role and some steps to play in that. So that's something that I recall. To your question around, finding resources, my first step has been to look to the Indigenous folks and the Indigenous allies on campuses, to at the very least find people who can share that perspective and who can share resources that they've gathered and connected to, and I think in allyship and in support, Indigenous folks, I know, just I can think of so many different instances across the US where those folks have stepped up on behalf of Pacific Islander students and communities, recognizing that Pacific Islanders are Indigenous people, despite being racialized within the US as, Asian Pacific Islander, right? So I have found that to be the case for me. I'd love to hear from my other panelists though.
I'll just say that I totally feel all those things, but also coming to realize that that sort of self-hate is kind of actively buying into colonization and the effects of colonization. And so once you kind of recognize that and hopefully start to change your mindset, then at least the bubbling insides can settle a bit, knowing that you aren't participating in that and your self-worth is more than buying into those false narratives.
Yeah, and I think it's remembering that even if you are at an institution, and it's a colonial institution that works within a system that wasn't built to benefit you, and expects you to leave your cultural coat at the academic institution door, you don't necessarily have to do that, because your worldview as a Pacific person in the diaspora is actually what's going to give you the edge, right? That is going to give you a different way of when you read a film, if you're having to write about film, if you're working in the area of mental well-being, that's going to, you know, all these different things, education, you're going to bring a very different lens to the way you interpret things. And sometimes it's at those boundaries, right, where the West and the Moana meet, where the most exciting things happen. We see it in film, we see it in education, we see it in so many different areas. And remember that. And as my Auntie Pepe said to me, it's in your bones. That's what she said, right? Your culture, your way of being, it's there. Even when you feel like you are disconnected from it, nobody can take away your ngafa, your genealogy from you. It's in there. So yeah, draw upon that and remember that that's what makes you unique. Oh, that was a bit of a pep talk, wasn't it?
Yes, love it.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dylan, for that question. So for our last question tonight, since filming Vi was such an incredible experience, do either of you have plans to do more collaborative films with other Indigenous women filmmakers?
No, okay, of course. Yeah, of course.
Are they?
No, never. Yeah, no, of course. Just a small plug. The Tana series that David mentioned at the top of this. I have a piece in it called Hiama. It's a short film. It's like a supernatural kind of horror. It's in Imaginative at the moment. It's in Hawaii, where you are, Natasha. So yeah, and that was
fun too.
And that was again with that Solomon Island lead, and my auntie's in it as well. But yeah, I think from here and for me, it's absolutely about collaborating with more Indigenous people, with more diverse peoples, and in many formats. And I think that that's really exciting, and I think that the world is kind of desperate for that too, you know, the content that we desire.
Yeah, most definitely. At the moment, I've just entered the last year of my PhD, so that's kind of dominating everything at the moment, in a very torturous way. So I'm just trying to get that done, and then the hope is that yeah, we'll get back into some filmmaking.
So next time you join us, we can call you Doctor.
Well, hopefully.
Yes. Well, thank you all again so much. I want to, if either any of you want to have any closing thoughts you'd like to share, just general, maybe things that didn't come up in the conversation, or just what you'd like to say to all the folks out there in virtual land.
Well, thank you for organizing this. It's so nice to be able to go back and remember, and it's wonderful that it and has some sort of relevance and resonance across the globe. And so really thankful for all of your hard work to put this together, and lovely to have my friend, always lovely to talk to my friend Marina, even though we talk constantly.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to watch Tana as well, because it is an incredible film, and also to think about Vi again, and the beauty that it brought to my life anyway, and just to talk with other people about film and Pacific issues, and to meet Dr. Saelua as well, and Dr. Stringer too. Yeah, I'm just really, really grateful that you put this on and invited us to be a part of it.
And I just have a big thank you to say again to all of you for participating. It's great. It's been wonderful to realize that you're just as eloquent in real life as you are in film. And thank you as well, Natasha, for joining us to give your own perspective on this. Is really much appreciated. That's all I have to say. A big thank you and eternal gratitude.
Natasha?
Oh, just echoing everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've been, shedding quiet tears and trying to wipe them away. It's been so refreshing, so amazing to meet everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And
Can
thank you
I
all.
just quickly ask, how can we read Natasha's Dr. Saelua's dissertation or research? How can we find out more about that?
Yeah, send it over, and then eventually it should be online, available eventually.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Making connections for some future collaborative projects, perhaps. Well, thank you all again for this beautiful conversation. And we appreciate also all of you at home for your thoughtful questions for our guests. I'd also like to thank the entire IU Cinema team, especially Seth, Will, and Max, who have all worked behind the scenes to make tonight's event possible. We encourage you to visit our website at cinema.indiana.edu for more information on all of our upcoming events, including more virtual programs like this, as well as screenings at IU Cinema. To all of you tuning in tonight, thank you once again for being with us. Please take care of yourselves and be kind and generous to others. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Brittany.